everyone, and welcome back to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. In tonight's 44th session, we discuss the last part of Chapter 17, the eponymous Goblet of Fire, in which we meet the Goblet of Fire and spend some time with the Goblet of Fire, and the entirety of Chapter 18, the Four Champions. And lest we fall into a pattern here at Dear Mr. Potter, I'm fearful of becoming a quasi-referential Steven Universe podcast here, but following on from our discussion in the last session of an actual giant woman, very exciting for fans of Steven Universe, we continue our running Steven Universe theme by discovering why the people of Hogwarts believe in Cedric, Victor Krum, and Fleur. And Harry. Definitely, and Harry. More on that as we move forward. First off, apologies for, I guess missing last week's show and then postponing this show. I was ill for a while, which meant that there was no Dear Mr. Potter for a week. And then when I sat down on Tuesday evening to give this session, to engage in this discussion with you all, the internet failed me. Crowdcast failed me. We are working on some alternative routes so that if there is just an outright software failure again in the future, I will at least be able to transition seamlessly and elegantly to YouTube or some other alternate broadcast platform, or perhaps even just record an audio version of the podcast. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but I'm looking into some alternatives and we're putting things in place so that hopefully won't happen again. But thank you all for joining me here on this Friday evening, surprisingly early on a Friday evening, though I know that it is Saturday morning for a number of our listeners, a number of the guests here in the chat who are joining us from Australia. So hello to Australia and hello to Saturday morning. I hope that when you get here, you bring nothing but good things and large cups of coffee, because that's a good way to spend a Saturday morning. So we pick up from the end of the last session where I kind of faltered toward the end of Chapter 17, the Goblet of Fire. We've introduced our visiting delegations from the other schools of witchcraft and wizardry, and we run through the announcements, the terms of the Triwizard Tournament and the Goblet of Fire itself. So we're going to have a couple of slides here from the end of Chapter 17, and then we're going to get into Chapter 18 and the selection of the four champions. Let's begin with our first slide here. Karkaroff turned and led his students toward the doors, reaching them at exactly the same moment as Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Harry stopped to let him walk through first. "Thank you," said Karkaroff carelessly, glancing at him, and then Karkaroff froze. He turned his head back to Harry and stared at him as though he couldn't believe his eyes. Behind their headmaster, the students from Durmstrang came to a halt, too. Karkaroff's eyes moved slowly up Harry's face and fixed upon his scar. The Durmstrang students were staring curiously at Harry, too. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry saw comprehension dawn on a few of their faces. The boy with food all down his front nudged the girl next to him and pointed openly at Harry's forehead. "Yeah, that's Harry Potter," said a growling voice from behind them. Professor Karkaroff spun around. Mad-Eye Moody was standing there, leaning heavily on his staff, his magical eye glaring unblinkingly at the Durmstrang headmaster. The color drained from Karkaroff's face as Harry watched. A terrible look of mingled fury and fear came over him. "You," he said, staring at Moody as though unsure he was really seeing him. "Me," said Moody grimly, "and unless you've got anything to say to Potter, Karkaroff, you might want to move. You're blocking the doorway." One of the details that I love most here, mostly this passage, is just setting up a little of the history of Mad-Eye Moody, a little of the contentious history between Aurors and Death Eaters, I suppose, those who were allied with Voldemort and those who stood in opposition to Voldemort. But what we're also getting here is a moment of resonance for Mad-Eye Moody himself. This little incidental detail that when he is facing down Karkaroff, his magical eye is fixed on him. This magical eye, which in every previous description has been roaming wildly hither and yon, keeping track of everything around Moody, which ties into our notion of the allegations concerning Moody's outright paranoia, right? He's constantly searching for threats in his immediate vicinity, but here he has identified the threat, and it is Karkaroff. And this is beautifully done. We are not perhaps completely on board with Mad-Eye Moody just yet. We are schooled, I think we are instructed to still be suspicious of him, not least of all because, hey, he's a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and those have not historically worked out terribly well. I mean, Remus Lupin is a great guy, but his tenure as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher was marked by a certain danger to Harry personally. So, following on the heels of Professor Quirrell and of Gilderoy Lockhart, we are inclined, I think, naturally to be suspicious of Mad-Eye Moody, but here, setting him in opposition to the grim, fur-bedecked Professor Karkaroff of Durmstrang, we are reinforcing our notion that Alistair Moody is a good guy, and also reinforcing the notion that Karkaroff is not, and in fact that Durmstrang is more dangerous, more outright dark than either Hogwarts or Beauxbaton, which is, I think, fairly reasonable. It's a fairly reasonable assertion to make at this point, and a fairly reasonable assumption for us to agree with. Let's move into a quick discussion here. I've just pulled this one slide. We talked about this at length last time, and I don't want to pass over it without comment, and I think the best way to comment upon it is just to glance at the excerpt. This is much later when Harry and Ron and Hermione have gone to Hagrid's hut, and Hermione is trying to convince Hagrid to join SPEW, and he is somewhat less than enthused at the prospect. A light rain had started to fall by mid-afternoon. It was very cozy sitting by the fire, listening to the gentle patter of the drops on the window, watching Hagrid darning his socks and arguing with Hermione about house elves, for he flatly refused to join SPEW when she showed him her badges. "It'd be doing them an unkindness, Hermione," he said gravely, threading a massive bone needle with thick yellow yarn. "It's in their nature to look after humans. That's what they like, see? You'd be making them unhappy to take away their work, and insulting them if you try to pay them." "But Harry set Dobby free and he was over the moon about it," said Hermione, "and we heard he's asking for wages now." "Yeah, well, you get weirdos in every breed. I'm not saying there isn't the odd elf who'd take freedom, but you'd never persuade most of them to do it. No, nothing doing, Hermione." Hermione looked very cross indeed and stuffed her box of badges back into her cloak pocket. We talked in the last session about good allyship and the way in which Hermione is co-opting the principle here, the noble and admirable principle that we should not, in fact, condone or advocate or employ slavery as a mechanism, particularly of comfort and provision here. Like, not a provocative statement, not a provocative position, actually pretty defensible. But Hermione is co-opting this principle without seeking to directly engage with the population she purports to represent. She is being a bad ally. She is speaking instead of the house elves rather than using her power, limited though it may be, to share her platform, to give voice to those who currently are deprived of voice, to represent and to give representation, to allow for representation among those people who are currently underrepresented or categorically unrepresented, in fact. Now, Hagrid here is striking a bit of a middle ground. He's not quite in that Ron Weasley, well, that's all they know, that's what they want, hey, why are you even rocking the boat? Like, why are you doing this thing? Because Hagrid is making a more sophisticated appeal to nature here. It's in their nature to look after humans, and that's what they like, see? You'd be making them unhappy to take away their work and insulting them if you tried to pay them, says Hagrid, making a kind of somewhat problematic political real-world point here, but a more nuanced philosophical point. He is at least making the utilitarian argument, right? What is the good for which you are campaigning here, Hermione? Is it happiness for house elves? Because arguably, at least from Hagrid's POV, they are happiest doing the thing that they are doing now. And if that is in contradiction with your personal politics and your personal policies, that's too bad for you. These house elves are not either being harmed or harming, thus the political discourse is a little more complicated. Hagrid is occupying a middle ground between Hermione's staunch and yet uninformed defense of house elves and Ron's outright dismissal of house elves. Or I suppose Ron is actually occupying that middle ground, right? Because at the far end of that, you've got the Malfoys and the conscious domination of house elves, like the deliberate, cruel oppression of house elves, which is possibly the furthest counterpoint from Hermione there. So if Ron is in the middle, if he's pinning the middle of that spectrum, then Hagrid is certainly more on Hermione's side, but much more thoughtfully, much more sensitively. This is at least if we take Hagrid at his word, which I know some readers are somewhat disinclined to do because, well, frankly, even by this point in the series, Hagrid has become a kind of comedic punctuation in the book. He's not really, if you'll forgive the unfortunate pun, carrying his own narrative weight anymore. He is now part of the backdrop of Hogwarts. We're going to have a better opportunity to talk about the transition in Hagrid's character from first book, I guess the third book being something of a fulcrum as it is for so many characters at Hogwarts, into what Hagrid ultimately becomes. Pretty dependent on the kids, actually. Like, that's where we're going to end up. But right now, he's occupying a more contested middle ground there. So I understand that some readers are unwilling to take this political point at face value, that what they are ascribing to Hagrid here instead is a very Ron Weasley dismissal of the house elves problem. But I'm inclined to read it more literally. I'm inclined to actually take Hagrid at his word and to understand that, no, his primary purpose here, as it is with so many magical creatures, right, is happiness and the fulfillment of one's nature. Is this actually the nature of house elves? Well, as I say, that's a charged political argument in the real world and certainly a charged political argument in the world of Harry Potter too. But if we take it at face value, if we are as generous as we can possibly be while acknowledging the problematic politics associated with this concept, if it is true, then Hagrid is perhaps occupying a more thoughtful and morally consistent point, a more morally consistent platform than Hermione herself. Good. Let's get into our discussion then of the champions and try to move toward a conclusion here. We've got 2 more slides here from chapter 17 before we get into chapter 18. The flames inside the goblet turned suddenly red again. Sparks began to fly from it. Next moment, a tongue of flame shot into the air. A charred piece of parchment fluttered out of it. The whole room gasped. Dumbledore, caught the piece of parchment and held it at arm's length so he could read it by the light of the flames, which had turned back to blue-white. "The champion for Durmstrang," he read in a strong, clear voice, "will be Victor Krum." "No surprises there," yelled Ron as a storm of applause and cheering swept the hall. Harry saw Victor Krum rise from the Slytherin table and slouch up toward Dumbledore. He turned right, walking along the staff table, and disappeared through the door into the next chamber. "Bravo, Victor!" boomed Karkaroff so loudly that everyone could hear him, even over all the applause. "Knew you had it in you!" The clapping and chatting died down. Now everyone's attention was focused again on the goblet, which seconds later turned red once more. A second piece of parchment shot out of it, propelled by the flames. "The champion for Beauxbaton," said Dumbledore, "is Fleur Delacour." "It's her, Ron!" Harry shouted as the girl who so resembled Avila got gracefully to her feet, shook back her sheet of silvery blonde hair, and swept up between the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables. "Oh, look, they're all disappointed," Hermione said over the noise, nodding toward the remainder of the Beauxbaton party. Disappointed was a bit of an understatement, Harry thought. 2 of the girls who had not been selected had dissolved into tears and were sobbing with their heads on their arms. When Fleur Delacour too had vanished into the side chamber, silence fell again. But this time it was a silence so stiff with excitement you could almost taste it. The Hogwarts champion next. And the Goblet of Fire turned red once more. Sparks showered out of it. The tongue of flame shot high into the air, and from its tip Dumbledore pulled the 3rd piece of parchment. "The Hogwarts champion," he called, "is Cedric Diggory." "No!" said Ron loudly, but nobody heard him, except Harry. The uproar from the next table was too great. Every single Hufflepuff had jumped to his or her feet, screaming and stamping as Cedric made his way past them, grinning broadly, and headed off toward the chamber behind the teacher's table. Indeed, the applause for Cedric went on so long that it was some time before Dumbledore could make himself heard again. Okay, there's going to be a twist in just a moment. Suffice it to say, the Goblet of Fire is not done for the evening. The Goblet of Fire has 1 more selection to make, and it may surprise you. It won't surprise you. I know, I'm just being playful. But there is another champion to come. But I want to look for a moment at the 3 champions who are selected. We've talked about the representation of Hufflepuff, of course, within the context of Hogwarts, what it is that being a Hufflepuff represents, and we had that codified for us most powerfully, of course, in the Sorting Hat song from earlier in this very book. And we've talked about what Durmstrang represents, and we've talked about what Beauxbaton represents, and we're kind of embodying each of these schools, each of these institutions in their most representative figure. It is fair to argue that if Cedric Diggory is the Hufflepuffiest Hufflepuff, then certainly it is fair to argue that Victor Krum is the Durmstrangest Durmstrang, right? And equally that Fleur is the Beauxbatonist Beauxbaton. They represent perfectly the virtues and aesthetics and style of their school, even their physicality here. You know the descriptions that we get from each of our champions as Krum rises from the Slytherin table and slouches up toward Dumbledore, right? This is how he receives his appointment as champion in the Triwizard Tournament. He slouches up toward Dumbledore. And he's an athlete, right? So you'd expect him to be possessed of a greater physicality than that. So the slouch is definitely an affect. The slouch is a Slytherin affect as he is approaching Dumbledore here. Now, Fleur, on the other hand, gets gracefully to her feet, shakes back her sheet of silvery blonde hair, and sweeps up between the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables. She is utterly feminine, utterly unperturbed by her appointment as champion, as of course she is. The other Beauxbaton girls, of course, not so much, disintegrating into tears, as we said. And then Cedric grins. That's how Cedric Diggory responds to being appointed the potential champion for Hogwarts. He just grins as Cedric made his way past them, grinning broadly, and headed off toward the chamber behind the teacher's table. That's all we get from him. Headed off kind of has a kind of buoyant energy to it. He's not slouching, he's not sweeping, he's heading off. It's got a kind of purposeful motility to it there, right? But the grin is arguably the most important thing. So all of this is to say that we are embodying here within our tripart champion structure here, within the 3 champions who have been chosen thus far, we are embodying the virtues of Beauxbaton, of Durmstrang, and of Hufflepuff. Let's look at Harry, and then we'll circle back around to this thought, and what the champions now are representing. "Excellent!" Dumbledore called happily as at last the tumult died down. "Well, we now have our 3 champions. I'm sure I can count upon all of you, including the remaining students from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, to give your champions every ounce of support you can muster. By cheering your champion on, you will contribute in a very real..." But Dumbledore suddenly stopped speaking, and it was apparent to everybody what had distracted him. The fire in the goblet had just turned red again. Sparks were flying out of it. A long flame shot suddenly into the air, and borne upon it was another piece of parchment. Automatically, it seemed Dumbledore reached out a long hand and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written upon it. There was a long pause, during which Dumbledore stared at the slip in his hands, and everyone in the room stared at Dumbledore. And then Dumbledore cleared his throat and read out, "Harry Potter." So Harry is the fourth champion. And I find this utterly fascinating because we have represented throughout the Harry Potter series these mirrored and echoed and reflected and symmetrical 3- and 4-part structures, right? The 4-part structure most notably, most powerfully represented in the 4 houses of Hogwarts. The 3-part structure most notably, most powerfully represented in our power trio themselves, in Harry and Ron and Hermione, this ethos, logos, pathos power trio that we've discussed before. Harry representing agency and force of will and action. He is the ethos, and Hermione is rationality and logic. She is the logos, and Ron is the heart. Ron is the compassion and the empathy and the loyalty and the goodness. He is the pathos there. That's our power trio structure. And that power trio structure is repeated all over the place in this book. Dumbledore and Hagrid and McGonagall, ethos, pathos and logos there. Justin Finch, Fletchley, and Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott in Hufflepuff, as we discussed back in Chamber of Secrets, another power trio right there. Even as we discussed in Prisoner of Azkaban, James Potter, Sirius Black, and Remus Lupin. I think it's absolutely fair to say that if James is the ethos, then Sirius is the pathos, and Remus is the logos. Remus Lupin is the Hermione of his particular group, which breaks down a little once we get to the Prisoner of Azkaban, but certainly if we're looking back at their school day, at their school experience, that does seem to match. Now, what's most interesting about the selection of champions, beyond the fact that we have pretty much represented the 4 schools of Hogwarts, as discussed before, right? The alliance is too strong. The alignment of the Durmstrang kids with the Slytherin kids seems to be very pronounced. They emerge from the water, they sit with the Slytherin kids in the Great Hall, right? Victor Crumb is the Slytherin hero. Cedric Diggory is obviously the Hufflepuff hero. Harry is obviously the Gryffindor hero. And Fleur Delacour, descending from the air, from the Beauxbaton carriage and sitting with the Ravenclaw kids, represents Ravenclaw. So we're kind of echoing the 4-house structure of Hogwarts here, but we're doing so in an incomplete way. Because I find it absolutely fascinating. Harry's presence in the Triwizard Tournament is a deviation. It is an abnormality. It is an unexpected complication. We're going to see that run through the rest of the book. But what's really interesting is that if we separate Harry out, if we distill him out of the Triwizard Tournament and we look at the 3 champions who are, quote unquote, properly appointed for the Triwizard Tournament, I struggle to see a structure there. I struggle to see anything that is particularly resonant with either any of the forms that we've seen before, any of the structural motifs that we've seen before in the Harry Potter series, or we'll see again in the future, or anything that's kind of classically representative, right? We're not getting a powerful structural or thematic opposition here between Victor and Fleur and Cedric. Instead, they seem to orbit Harry. Harry is going to be the anchor point. And we did talk before. I had a question. I'm afraid that my faltering memory cannot now recall who asked this very insightful and brilliant question. I think at the end of the last session, whether or not the 3 challenges associated with the Triwizard Tournament would be reflective of that ethos, pathos, logos structure. And having thought about it, I think they absolutely are. And I think we're going to get them in that order. I think the first, no spoilers here, but I think the first trial is ethos. It is anchored in bravery, right? We're going to get to that in the very near future. The second trial is absolutely anchored in pathos. It is anchored in a very specific kind of loyalty and love, actually. And then the third trial is complicated because of the way that it plays out, but it is fundamentally rational, right? The existence of a labyrinth is leaning us, inclining us toward logos. But even then, this triplicate structure for the challenges, this triplicate structure for our power trio, right? Not the first time that we've seen this. You'll remember right back at the end of Philosopher's Stone, we saw our power trio challenged by obstacles which really reflected their own skills and gifts, right? Ron falls, Hermione falls, and Harry goes on to the end by himself. This is a pretty common feature of Harry Potter stories by this point. We're inverting all of this. We're changing all of this. And this is purposeful, I think. And I think that when I say purposeful, it's narratively purposeful, of course, but I also suspect that it was conscious on the part of J.K. Rowling. Because what are we doing in Goblet of Fire if not blowing out all of the old structures, blowing out all of the old traditional, predictable roles and models and ruts that we have established so far. Goblet of Fire is the external turning point, I suppose, in the entire series. I've argued before that Prisoner of Azkaban is the internal turning point. Everything changes in Prisoner of Azkaban, but it changes internally. Goblet of Fire is the point where everything literally changes externally. By the time we get to the end of this book, we are not in the same world as we are at the beginning of the book. Things are very powerfully different. And I'm interested in the way in which these structures are mirrored and replicated through the series as a whole, through this book, through different populations and different sets of characters, different formalized structures, both within the narrative and as a part of the text, and those odd and interesting moments when they are not, when suddenly we're dealing with something that isn't resonant in exactly the same way as we would expect it to be. A counterpoint for this, I suppose, and a constant kind of a constant tantalizing, tempting thought that I have on the fringes of my awareness as I'm thinking about Harry Potter is Draco Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle, and the extent to which it would have been trivial to make Crabbe and Goyle analogues for Ron and Hermione, right? It would have been not just trivial, it would have been obvious. I think you have to push against that tendency in order to arrive at Draco Malfoy and his two henchmen, right? There's very little to differentiate Crabbe and Goyle at all, and it's very difficult to read them as matches for Ron and Hermione, as analogues for Ron and Hermione. This is one of those moments where I feel that the narrative is deliberately subverting my expectation, is deliberately choosing not to engage with this replicated structure, when engaging with the replicated structure would be easier and arguably more powerful, like more thematically resonant at the heart of the story, particularly if you go back to the first book, when we really are opposing Draco and Harry in an interesting way. All of that is to say, the four champions are absolutely fascinating. Let me catch up. I want actually to jump into the questions bucket here because we did have some interesting questions. Let me see. Angela asked a couple of questions that I'm just going to gloss here because I know that there's really no satisfying answer to any of these questions. Angela asks, how does the goblet choose the champions? Does it have a piece of sentience like the sorting hat? How does it zero in on the student's name? Link with that student through their handwriting? Moody said it's programmed with the 3 schools for choosing, but someone fooled it with a 4th school entry with only Harry. What? And how does it deem the student worthy? By their deeds, their character, their heart, their report cards? How? Or did the goblet choose plot wisely? Yes, Angela, yes, the goblet chose plot. The goblet did exactly what J.K. Rowling wanted it to do, because otherwise we don't have as much of a story. There is a version of this story. There is a really intriguing version of the story where Harry is not selected as the champion of Hogwarts, right? Where he's not actually engaging in the Triwizard Tournament at all. And this is just unfolding in the background. I'm not saying that that wouldn't actually be an interesting story. I think it would be really interesting at this point in Harry's school career to deal with him not being the center of attention, but it's a much quieter story. It's a much more slow burn story, and it's not classically a Harry Potter story. So yes, the goblet makes the choices that it does because we need Harry involved for the plot. It's going to be explained later, right? This is not a mystery to people who have finished this book. It will be explained later, but it's going to take some time to get to that point. So why the goblet, and how does the goblet make the decisions that it makes? Well, the goblet, we know, cannot be monitoring any objective criteria. That is to say that the goblet cannot be going by report cards, for example, because it is a surprise to everyone who is selected. Fleur does not have the most, or Fleur possibly has the best report card from all of the kids in the Beauxbaton delegation, but we don't know that for sure. And if we knew that that was going to be the criteria, then someone would have figured that out and would have said, actually, it's the person with the highest grade in Transfiguration. That's who gets selected, right? That is clearly not the case. It does seem to be much more random, though it does. See, here we have an interesting problem, because the narrative is connecting us to Victor Crumb and to Fleur Delacour before we get to the Goblet of Fire, which suggests that the goblet picks the most important people. It picks the 3 people that Harry knows, right? It doesn't pick some random Durmstrang kid that we've never heard of. No, it picks the 3 people that we've been introduced to in the narrative already. That is not a consequence of the goblet, I think, as much as it is a consequence of the narrative voice surrounding these events. We can also speculate that the goblet itself does not, in fact, have a spark of sapience to it. It is not possessed of a personality in the way that the Sorting Hat is possessed of a personality, and we can be pretty sure of that for two reasons. One, as Angela calls out, Professor Moody's assertion that the Goblet of Fire has been programmed, right? That suggests something mechanistic. It hasn't been instructed, it has been programmed. Secondly, if it has a spark of sapience, if it itself is aware of the rules of the Triwizard Tournament, then A, we don't need the age line, right? That becomes irrelevant because it will select. It will be able to select from established criteria. It will be able to say, no, you are too young and cannot take part. I will choose this other person. And it will also be able to say, hey, the Triwizard Tournament probably shouldn't have 4 champions in it, right? That seems incorrect. So it seems to be the equivalent of a large punch bowl with slips of paper in it. There doesn't seem to be, and believe me, I've looked, and if you can think of an example of this that I've somehow overlooked, please let me know. I would love for this to be true. But the Goblet of Fire doesn't seem to be anything terribly special. It doesn't seem to be anything particularly magical. Beyond the flames and the parchment floating out of it, of course, there's nothing sapient, nothing sentient about the goblet itself. It is unlike the Sorting Hat in that way. Why does it choose the champions that it chooses? I think it's random. I think it is able to choose one kid at random from each school, and that Harry is chosen not to represent Hogwarts, but to represent the Harry Potter Academy for being awesome at everything. That's the school t-shirt that Harry's going to be wearing for the rest of the season. Actually, that's a great t-shirt. I should make that for Point North. I've just really amused myself. There we go. Yeah, I think the Harry Potter school for being awesome at everything would actually be a really great school, and Harry Potter is, of course, the representative from that school. Everything works if you assume that the goblet is just selecting randomly one kid from each school that is submitted. The only contrivance here, the only coincidence here that can't really be explained is the coincidence that Harry's name is drawn last. That we do the 3 schools that are expected and not Harry. Like, it would be one thing and the representative from Durmstrang will be Victor Crumb, and the second representative will be Harry, and then Cedric. Wow, this is weird. Like, there's no way of knowing, I suppose. Though I guess Harry's name, the school must be written on the parchment, right? It is for the other kids. So is Harry's name... I'm perhaps overthinking this. Angela, the reason is the goblet chooses plot. Yes. And you had another question here too. Oh, that's from the next chapter. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Yes. Okay. Becca asking, is it fair to say the goblet is made of narrativium like Mjolnir? This is tying back to a conversation that I had recently, have had more than once, in fact, on the Excelsior podcast, a comic book podcast that I produce over at Common Room Radio, about the workings of Thor's magic hammer Mjolnir and how it does the amazing things that it does and what the rules are governing the wielding of Mjolnir. And the answer is Mjolnir is magic narrativium. It does whatever the plot demands of it. So yes, I think the goblet is absolutely constructed entirely of narrativium, just like Mjolnir. I should credit, by the way, narrativium is not a word or a concept that I've invented. It comes from the Science of Discworld books, or possibly even from the Discworld books themselves. I don't remember if it crops up in the Discworld novels after the Science of Discworld books were written. The Science of Discworld books are fantastic. I believe there are 3 or possibly 4. They're very, very good. They alternate chapters of Discworld story with the explanation of actual science as the Wizards of the Disc, the Wizards of the Unseen University, struggle to create a universe that works on consistent rules of physics rather than rules of narrative and storytelling. Very good series. I suggest that you check that out. I guess Angela does have another question here. Actually crediting this question to Melissa. Melissa asked about the binding contract, but I don't have her exact question, Angela writes. What would happen if Harry broke the contract? What are the consequences that everyone is taking so seriously? Would they all die? Would Hogwarts explode? What? We're never told. We're never told what the magical contract is, and the magical contract is just a contrivance so that we can get across that line to the start of the Triwizard Tournament and not go back. There is nothing stopping anyone from saying, actually, Harry... Okay, we believe you, kid, whatever. We believe that you didn't put your name in the Goblet of Fire. We believe that you didn't circumvent Dumbledore's age line. Fine, all right? No harm, no foul, but go sit down, Harry. That would be, a completely appropriate response, except, of course, that he can't because he's now magically contracted to take part in the tournament. This is just the no take-back rule, in effect, yeah. We could circumvent that with some more elaborate plot structuring, but yeah, there's no interest in it, and we never get an explanation of the magical contract. With all of that said, hey, let's move on to chapter 18, the 4 champions here. We're making great time this evening. This is fantastic. Harry sat there, aware that every head in the great hall had turned to look at him. He was stunned. He felt numb. He was surely dreaming. He had not heard correctly. There was no applause. A buzzing as though of angry bees was starting to fill the hall. Some students were standing up to get a better look at Harry as he sat, frozen, in his seat. Up at the top table, Professor McGonagall had got to her feet and swept past Ludo Bagman and Professor Karkaroff to whisper urgently to Professor Dumbledore, who bent his ear toward her, frowning slightly. Harry turned to Ron and Hermione. Beyond them, he saw the long Gryffindor table, all watching him, open-mouthed. "I didn't put my name in," Harry said blankly. "You know I didn't." Both of them just stared just as blankly back. At the top table, Professor Dumbledore had straightened up, nodding to Professor McGonagall. "Harry Potter!" he called again. "Harry, up here, if you please." "Go on," Hermione whispered, giving Harry a slight push. Harry got to his feet, trod on the hem of his robes, and stumbled slightly. He set off up the gap between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables. It felt like an immensely long walk. The top table didn't seem to be getting any nearer at all, and he could feel hundreds and hundreds of eyes upon him, as though each were a searchlight. The buzzing grew louder and louder. After what seemed like an hour, he was right in front of Dumbledore, feeling the stares of all the teachers upon him. "Through the door, Harry," said Dumbledore. He wasn't smiling. We've talked from the very beginning of Dear Mr. Potter about Harry's exceptionalism and the ways in which the myriad rules of wizarding society and Hogwarts specifically fail to apply to Harry Potter. He can, pretty much, do what he wants. More than that, in fact, he can pretty much be encouraged to do what he wants. Pretty much everyone in his life will aid him when it comes to breaking the rules and being amazing. This is a turn. This is something new. The rules have been laid out, and Harry has explicitly been included in the population of Hogwarts. Why is Harry's notoriety here so controversial? Well, there is some Gryffindor Hufflepuff stuff, which we'll get to in due course right at the end of the chapter. But in general, Harry has been deliberately excluded and has stepped up nonetheless. He has done what Harry Potter does, and he's got involved in something that doesn't concern him, that isn't an appropriate adventure for him, isn't an appropriate arena for him to demonstrate his exceptionalism, and yet here he is. This is why we have the skepticism. More on that as we move forward. Yeah, poor Harry, says Lauren here. It is kind of heartbreaking, actually, right? I didn't put my name in, Harry said blankly. You know I didn't. Harry has been caught out before, right? Harry has been caught breaking the rules and has paid the price for that. Harry has crossed lines. Harry has been confrontational. Harry has been exceptional in a number of ways. And while that has been difficult for him, he's generally been supported. He's generally been lauded for it. This is very different. He's completely innocent here. We know narratively that he in fact did not put his name in. He has not circumvented the age line. He has not broken the rules. And now this wonderful thing has been bestowed upon him. And because of the magical contract and the working of the Goblet of Fire, it has to stick. There's no way out, though it's interesting that we don't really address Harry's desire to go back on this decision or to withdraw from the Triwizard Tournament. I mean, you might expect him to at least ask about the consequences of breaking the contract, right? Like, okay, but if I don't do this, if I go back to my normal life, what exactly happens? No, Harry is too exceptional for that. Harry is too much the classical hero for that. There is a challenge and Harry will rise to meet it. That's what he does. But still, this is unjust. This is unfair. In fact, unjust is going to be a very significant word as we move forward. Let's get on to the champions who are sitting in the next room. Victor Crumb, Cedric Diggory, and Fleur Delacour were grouped around the fire. They looked strangely impressive, silhouetted against the flames. Crumb, hunched up and brooding, was leaning back against the mantelpiece, slightly apart from the other two. Cedric was standing with his hands behind his back, staring into the fire. Fleur Delacour looked around when Harry walked in and threw back her sheet of long, silvery hair. "What is it?" she said. "Do they want us back in the hall?" She thought he had come to deliver a message. Harry didn't know how to explain what had just happened. He just stood there, looking at the three champions. It struck him how very tall all of them were. There was a sound of scurrying feet behind him, and Ludo Bagman entered the room. He took Harry by the arm and led him forward. "Extraordinary," he muttered, squeezing Harry's arm. "Absolutely extraordinary. Gentlemen, lady," he added, approaching the fireside and addressing the other three, "may I introduce, incredible though it may seem, the fourth Triwizard champion?" Victor Crumb straightened up. His surly face darkened as he surveyed Harry. Cedric looked nonplussed. He looked from Bagman to Harry and back again, as though sure he must have misheard what Bagman had said. Fleur Delacour, however, tossed her hair, smiling, and said, "Oh, very funny joke, Mr. Bagman." "Joke?" Bagman repeated, bewildered. No, not at all. Harry's name just came out of the Goblet of Fire." Crumb's thick eyebrows contracted slightly. Cedric was still looking politely bewildered. Fleur frowned. "But evidently there has been a mistake," she said contemptuously to Bagman. "He cannot compete. He is too young." I love the structure of this. I love the physical structure that we get represented in this room after just saying, hey, you know how there's no structure between the three Triwizard champions except with the inclusion of Harry and the resonance with the Hogwarts houses? There is no thematic structure or little thematic structure, but there is a physical structure here, right? Standing around the fire, Victor Crumb on one side, Fleur Delacour on the other, and Cedric Diggory pinned between the two of them. This kind of compromise between the masculine virtues of Victor and the feminine virtues of Fleur. And you'll note that we get this repeated 3 times here. So we get Crumb hunched up and brooding, was leaning against the mantelpiece, slightly apart from the other two. Cedric was standing with his hands behind his back, staring into the fire. Fleur looks around. So Crumb is hunched up and withdrawn. Cedric is entirely neutral, just staring into the fire, right? His is a neutral position. And Fleur is engaged. She turns around. Then again, when Bagman comes in and explains to them what is happening, we get another triplicate response here. Victor Crumb straightened up, his surly face darkened as he surveyed Harry. Cedric looked nonplussed. He looked from Bagman to Harry and back again as though he was sure he must have misheard what Bagman had said. Fleur Delacour, however, tossed her hair smiling and said, "Oh, very funny joke, Mr. Bagman." Also, Fleur just tosses her hair all the time. Like, she is constantly shaking out her hair or tossing her hair or doing some shampoo commercial thing with her hair for which I have no appropriate name. Like, I don't know what those things are called, being bald as I am. That's just a little character detail for Fleur Delacour there. So we get this surly and separated neutral and positive engagement from the three of them. And I'm saying positive here not in the good sense, but I suppose in the active sense, right? She is the one who turns to look at Harry. She is the one who speaks to Ludo Bagman and assumes that this is a joke. And then when he clarifies, we get Crumb's thick eyebrows contracted slightly. Cedric was still looking politely bewildered. Fleur frowned and speaks again. It's the same setup. Crumb is dark and is brooding and is somewhat contemptuous, and Cedric is neutral and affable and kind of open to the possibility and not judging or responding until he has all of the information. And Fleur is the active one. She is the one who is responding outright. It's pretty good. It's a nicely constructed beat here. And I love, of course, how Harry looks at these three kids who are, yes, a couple of years older than he is, but are still children. But here in the chamber beside the Great Hall of Hogwarts, a chamber which, to the best of my recollection, we never see or acknowledge again in the entire series. I'm not sure that this specific chamber is, I mean, maybe it is. Maybe this is a chamber that's mentioned all the time, and it's just the geography is bothering me because I have this thing about working out the geography of fictional places and how these spaces intersect and interlock. But in any case, I love that we step out of the Great Hall, threshold transition, you guys, into the chamber with the fire, and he sees them impressive, silhouetted against the flames, taller than he expected, taller than he remembered, because they are in this space. They have been selected. They have been chosen. They are champions. And while they have been empowered, while they have been embiggened by this selection process, Harry has been reduced. He doesn't deserve to be here. He doesn't get to stand here with these people. And that's going to be the focal point of the rest of the chapter, really. Pretty much the rest of the chapter. Yeah. Yes. Magique is saying here in the chat that it's rules of requirement. Rules shows up just when it's needed. Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. This is just an extra bonus chamber that we use pretty much only for the Triwizard Tournament. Yes. Good. Okay. Let's move forward. The door behind them opened again, and a large group of people came in. Professor Dumbledore, followed closely by Mr. Crouch, Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, Professor McGonagall, and Professor Snape. Harry heard the buzzing of the hundreds of students on the other side of the wall before Professor McGonagall closed the door. "Madame Maxime," said Fleur at once, striding over to her headmistress. "They are saying that this little boy is to compete also?" Somewhere under Harry's numb disbelief, he felt a ripple of anger. Little boy. Madame Maxime had drawn herself up to her full and considerable height. The top of her handsome head brushed the candle-filled chandelier, and her gigantic black satin bosom swelled. "What is the meaning of this, Dumbledore?" she said imperiously. "I'd rather like to know that myself, Dumbledore," said Professor Karkaroff. He was wearing a steely smile, and his blue eyes were like chips of ice. "2 Hogwarts champions. I don't remember anyone telling me the host school is allowed 2 champions. Or have I not read the rules carefully enough?" He gave a short and nasty laugh. "C'est impossible," said Madame Maxime, whose enormous hand with its many superb opals was resting upon Fleur's shoulder. "Hogwarts cannot have 2 champions. It is most unjust. We were under the impression that your age line would keep out younger contestants, Dumbledore," said Karkaroff, his steely smile still in place, though his eyes were colder than ever. "Otherwise, we would, of course, have brought along a wider selection of candidates from our own schools." "It's no one's fault but Potter's, Karkaroff," said Snape softly. His black eyes were alight with malice. "Don't go blaming Dumbledore for Potter's determination to break rules. He's been crossing lines ever since he arrived here. Thank you, Severus, said Dumbledore firmly, and Snape went quiet, though his eyes still glinted malevolently through his curtain of greasy black hair. Hey, you know, if we're talking about injustice, I'm going to go back to the questions bucket here and take a question from Angela, who asked, when the adults join the champions, where is Professor Sprout? Cedric is her champion. Why is Snape there? Is he just a voice of dissension, or is he a voice of reason reminding us of Harry's age? Yes, Snape is there because he is Harry's enemy. Snape is there... Okay, outside of Harry's POV, Snape is there because something is happening at Hogwarts and Snape wants to be included. Something here is going wrong and Snape wants his say. He wants to be on record as being a part of this discussion because proximity to power is apparently very important to Severus Snape. Where is the Hufflepuff professor, Professor Sprout? We don't know. It is weird that Professor Sprout does not appear here. Yeah, full credit to you for that, Angela. Yes, good. Rohit says, I think it's just in Sprout's nature not to want to intervene and impose herself. Yeah, maybe there's a private scene later where Professor Sprout congratulates Cedric Diggory and just speaks warm words of affirmation to him and congratulates Cedric for being nominated the Hufflepuff champion. But yes, I know. And even then we ought to be a little bit careful, right? Cedric is not the Hufflepuff champion. Cedric is the Hogwarts champion. He's from Hufflepuff, which is important in the sense that it increases the tension between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff and kind of encourages the children to ally themselves behind their chosen hero, though presumably the Ravenclaw and Slytherin kids could care less, I suppose, about that particular division, except to the extent that the Slytherin kids probably aren't going to support the Gryffindor champion. But the breaking points at which both Cedric and Harry are champions representative of their houses and champions representative of Hogwarts are really, really interesting. We're going to see, I guess, actually a little hint of that right at the beginning of the first test. Really, we're not going to see that until the third test. We're going to see that toward the end of the book, but we will be paying close attention to that when we get there, because these tests are interesting challenges of identity and of presence and of purpose. Like, they are very specifically focused, not at these individuals, but at the very concept of individuality. They are heroic challenges in that sense. So we're going to be paying close attention to identity. We're going to be paying close attention to individuality and what that means to Fleur and to Victor, to a lesser extent, and certainly to Cedric and Harry. That's going to be very important through the rest of the book. Yeah, good. Let's keep going here, because it's about time that someone asked Harry what was going on. Professor Dumbledore was now looking down at Harry, who looked right back at him, trying to discern the expression of the eyes behind the half-moon spectacles. "Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire, Harry?" he asked calmly. "No," said Harry. He was very aware of everybody watching him closely. Snape made a soft noise of impatient disbelief in the shadows. "Did you ask an older student to put it into the Goblet of Fire for you?" said Professor Dumbledore, ignoring Snape. "No," said Harry vehemently. "Ah, but of course he is lying," cried Madame Maxime. Snape was now shaking his head, his lip curling. "He could not have crossed the age line," said Professor McGonagall sharply. "I'm sure we're all agreed on that." "Dumbledore must have made a mistake with the line," said Madame Maxime, shrugging. "It is possible, of course," said Dumbledore politely. "Dumbledore, you know perfectly well you did not make a mistake," said Professor McGonagall angrily. "Really, what nonsense. Harry could not have crossed that line himself, and as Professor Dumbledore believes that he did not persuade an older student to do it for him, I'm sure that should be good enough for everybody else." She shot a very angry look at Professor Snape. If you're ever challenged by an immense French woman, it is good to have Minerva McGonagall on your side. Just a note for all of us. Just a little life lesson here for you from the pages of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. In fact, there pretty much isn't a circumstance where you don't want Minerva McGonagall on your side, come to think of it. There is here a really interesting pressure put on honesty. Put on honest intent and then an honest accounting, right? Dumbledore is asking Harry very specific and pointed questions. And yes, those of you who have read the rest of the series might well be wondering, hey, a small application of Veritaserum couldn't hurt here, right? Like, we couldn't maybe just dose him up and then that would solve this whole problem. And then we would know that we actually had a mystery to deal with and not just a weird contrivance, not just a weird coincidence here. This is something else entirely. Dumbledore turning to Harry and offering him the opportunity to be honest. And I don't think that Dumbledore here believes that Harry has has eluded the age line. I don't believe that Dumbledore thinks that Harry has put his own name in the Goblet of Fire, honestly. I think that's, did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire, Harry? He asked calmly, and then he pushes further. Did you ask an older student to put it into the Goblet of Fire for you? Completely acknowledging, by the way, that that is a way around the age line. There is nothing stopping a senior student at Hogwarts from writing the name of every single kid in the school and dumping them all in the Goblet of Fire, right? Magical contract, you guys. Any kid that's pulled out of that list is going to have to compete. That's how it works. The age line, not great. Not Dumbledore's finest moment, I think. Honesty has a really interesting role in the works of Harry Potter, and I almost feel as though it's too early to have this discussion, right? I almost feel as though we don't have enough points of data accumulated through the first 3 books and the first half of Goblet of Fire to really talk about honesty, because it's going to become so much more important later. Things that are said and are meant, things that are said but are not meant, and things that are meant but not said, right? The kind of those things which are true and expressed, false and expressed, and true but unexpressed. These are going to be incredibly significant later. And I love that and the reason for this, the reason that we're putting the pressure on this at this point, I think, is because we are acknowledging Harry's transition into adulthood. This is something new. This flat asking here, and Minerva McGonagall's support of Dumbledore firstly, and Harry a long way second. These are recognitions that Harry is now becoming a young man and is both responsible for his actions in a way that he was not before, or can be held responsible for his actions in a way that he could not before, because you can't really hold children for, the consequences of their judgment. You can instruct and guide and even to a certain extent punish, as Harry has been punished before, but you can't judge in quite the way that you would judge with an adult, I think. Harry here, though, is transitioning out of that earlier world into that latter world, and we'll see more examples of that as we go forward. Yeah. Yes, Angela asking, yes, so how does the goblet work? No one person could dump all the student names, regardless of age, into the goblet. Yeah, it could happen. It could definitely happen. I don't know why Fred and George Weasley were wasting all of their time, trying to elude the age line and shaving the beards that resulted when they could just, I don't know, go dupe Hagrid into doing it. Go get Filch to do it. Go give Filch a small sack of galleons, and he would definitely do it for you. I have no doubt of that. Yeah. Ryan asks, could an of-age student put anyone's name in the goblet? If someone wrote Meryl Streep's name, would she be picked and inevitably win? She would be bound by the magical contract, right? She would be bound by the magical contract. We know that the specifics of one's school are not actually binding because, of course, Harry is not listed as a Hogwarts student. So that is not enough to disqualify him. The name is the only thing that matters. Yeah, I just don't know. 2 students with the same name, perhaps? What would happen then if 2 students have the same name, which is unlikely in a student body the size of Hogwarts, but let's be generous and let's expand it out. Let's assume that every wizard in Britain was going to do it. And Arthur Smith, 4th-year student, 6th-year student at Hogwarts, puts in his name. Could that relate to another? How are these things that... We really can't speculate that far. We just don't have enough information, and there's just no real conclusion to come to, unfortunately. It is a thin bit of plotting. It really is. And if we're being completely candid about it, I suppose, not only is it a thin bit of plotting, which it's not the first time that we've seen that in the works of Harry Potter. Sometimes so caught up is she in the movement of the story that J.K. Rowling doesn't necessarily want to mechanistically explain in fine detail how these plots unfold, right? There are points of confusion and points of speculation going back to the very first book and will be going all the way through to the end of the series. There are things that we just don't know and can't figure out. Oh, but how come this? There are lots of unanswered questions, or questions that were unanswered by the end of the series and which have subsequently oftentimes been answered in interviews and on Pottermore.com. J.K. Rowling is willing to skate over the details when she is delivering us a powerful and resonant emotional scene. For me, the goblet kind of falters in both directions. I don't find it particularly impressive. I don't find it particularly magical and evocative and enticing in that way that I would like it to be, but it also doesn't serve its mechanistic purpose. It is a little bit thin. Luckily, it's dispensed with almost immediately, which does make it weird that it's in the title of the book, right? That does make it odd that I feel that it's not even like a terribly original fantasy name, right? Philosopher's Stone, okay, the reference works there. Chamber of Secrets, kind of tropey, kind of standard, but better. Prisoner of Azkaban, that's great, because now we're getting into proper noun territory, right? No one else has an Azkaban. Prisoner of Azkaban is something uniquely Harry Potter. Order of the Phoenix, a little tropey again, but still good and unusual, and certainly evocative, right? That's a great name. Half-Blood Prince, a little tropey. Again, like, when I say tropey, all I mean is like conventional fantasy title, right? You can imagine another fantasy novel by the name of, not Harry Potter and the, but you can imagine another fantasy novel by the name of The Order of the Phoenix or The Half-Blood Prince. But I think that reaches its peak here in Goblet of Fire. Goblet of Fire could have been, an unpublished Dragonlance novel from 1984 for, all the difference that it makes, for all the uniquity that it bears to it, for all the resonance that it has with the Harry Potter universe itself. And then, of course, we get Deathly Hallows, which, like Azkaban, works beautifully because that is a completely unconventional arrangement, right? You can imagine another fantasy novel having the name The Deathly Hallows, but it would still catch your attention. It would still stand out. And Goblet of Fire doesn't, and the goblet itself, pretty weak. But I am more than willing to invest my belief with sufficient force and sufficient acuity that we can propel ourselves past this stumbling block in the middle of the book, because, as I say, I honestly believe that this book is enormously fascinating. And while we're a little thin on the plot here, I wish that we had put more scaffolding around this. I wish that we had machined a better plot to get Harry into the Triwizard Tournament. It works well enough. It works well enough, I think. Let's see here as we get the return of fan favorite character, Mad-Eye Moody. Imagining things, am I? Growled Moody. Seeing things, eh? It was a skilled witch or wizard who put the boy's name in that goblet. What evidence is there of that? Said Madame Maxime, throwing up her huge hands. Because they hoodwinked a very powerful magical object, said Moody. They would have needed an exceptionally strong confundus charm to bamboozle that goblet into forgetting that only 3 schools compete in the tournament. I'm guessing they submitted Potter's name under a 4th school to make sure he was the only one in his category. You seem to have given this a great deal of thought, Moody, said Karkaroff coldly, and a very ingenious theory it is, though, of course. I heard you recently got it into your head that one of your birthday presents contained a cunningly disguised basilisk egg and smashed it to pieces before realizing it was a carriage clock. So you'll understand if we don't take you entirely seriously. There are those who'll turn innocent occasions to their advantage, Moody retorted in a menacing voice. It's my job to think the way dark wizards do, Karkaroff, as you ought to remember. Alistair, said Dumbledore warningly. Harry wondered for a moment whom he was speaking to, but then realized Mad-Eye could hardly be Moody's real first name. Moody fell silent, though still surveying Karkaroff with satisfaction. Karkaroff's face was burning. How this situation arose, we do not know, said Dumbledore, speaking to everyone gathered in the room. It seems to me, however, that we have no choice but to accept it. Both Cedric and Harry have been chosen to compete in the tournament. This, therefore, they will do. But Dumbledore, my dear Madame Maxime, if you have an alternative, I would be delighted to hear it. Well, says Dumbledore, the plot is the plot, and I'm looking at the page count, and we should probably get started. We're significantly into the book at this point. This is our confrontation with Mad-Eye Moody, and another confrontation between Mad-Eye Moody and Karkaroff, and of course the reveal of Mad-Eye Moody's first name, the egregiously misspelled Alistair. Like, I am accustomed to seeing my first name spelled in a number of alternate ways, right? My spelling, Alastair, isn't even the most common spelling in Scotland. You'll often find it with a D instead, particularly if you're in the lowlands on the east coast. But I've never seen Alastor. This is kind of good. I like this. So many of Rowling's characters have brilliant names, right? They are either brilliant in their ingenious and evocative specificity. Severus Snape, Minerva McGonagall. I know I'm picking 2 alliterative versions there. Neville Longbottom, right, is a brilliant name, and we haven't even met Luna Lovegood, who is in fact, I don't know if you can in fact see her, but she is standing on the shelf behind me. I've got the little Funko Pop of Luna Lovegood on the shelf behind me, right next to Rupert Giles from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I like to imagine that he's training her as a future Slayer. That's just a little diorama that I've created for you guys at home. So names in J.K. Rowling's world are oftentimes very good, either in the sense that they are brilliantly evocative fantasy names or very specific, pieces of characterization in and of themselves, or in absolutely the opposite way, in the fact that they are horribly ungainly and non-specific. Barty Crouch, Ludo Bagman, for example. These are Cedric Diggory, even, right? These are kind of bad. I get the connection of Cedric Diggory to Hufflepuff, right? Badger's gonna badge, and so on and so forth. But it's an ungainly and kind of unromantic name in a way that works beautifully. Victor Crumb, Fleur Delacour, Cedric Diggory, one of these things is not like the other. And I love J.K. Rowling's power with names. Alastor, spelled Alastor, feels foreshortened, feels odd and ungainly. Perhaps I'm the only one thinking of this because I've spent a lot of my life thinking about the spelling of the name Alistair, but that's obviously, it stands out to me. Alistair Moody has a very kind of brooding and ungainly and slightly twisted and stunted kind of sense to it, just as a name, which seems to speak beautifully to the character himself. Yeah. Yes. Karen saying, I always assumed it was a name distinct from Alistair and would be pronounced differently. Yeah, certainly. I not that I can imagine. Alastor, I suppose, maybe, but yeah, Alistair seems to be. If you do it in the Scots inflection, it's that O phone, that O vowel sound, the tor phoneme that you get there at the end actually sounds pretty good to me. So I'm going to stick with Alistair. But yes, good. Good. Ryan saying here in the chat, I'm like that way when I see the name Ryan Johnson spelled R-I-A-N. I'm like, that's not how you spell it. Yeah. Hannah C saying, hey, we just had a baby. What should we call him? I know, Mad Eye. He looks like a baby who will lose an eye and gain a magical one. I like that very much. Oh, and Raven Darkholm pointing out that as we know from Supernatural, Americans like to say Alastair. Yes, they do. They really like to emphasize the AI there at the end, which I get a lot. And honestly, this is the thing. I've spent my whole life with this name, so I don't mind. I don't mind how you pronounce it. I don't even mind how you spell it. I oftentimes get in emails and stuff to pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. Apologies if I've misspelled your name. Apologies if this is... It's fine, you guys. It's fine. You can spell Alistair any way you like, as long as you make like a good concerted effort. All right. We are an hour in and we have just a few more slides to go. So let's see if we can push through to the end of this somewhat curtailed reading here. Yes. Mr. Crouch seemed to come out of a deep reverie. So this is the point at which we have established that because of the scaffolding we've slapped into place around this core conceit, Harry is going to be taking part in the Triwizard Tournament. The Triwizard Tournament is going to have 4 champions this year. There's nothing to be done about it. This is, we're all just backed into a corner. This is how it's going to be. And so now we transition into the rest of the chapter. We start looking ahead to this first task. Mr. Crouch seemed to come out of a deep reverie. Yes, he said. Instructions, yes. The first task. He moved forward into the firelight. Close up, Harry thought he looked ill. There were dark shadows beneath his eyes and a thin, papery look about his wrinkled skin that had not been there at the Quidditch World Cup. The first task is designed to test your daring, he told Harry, Cedric, Fleur, and Victor. So we are not going to be telling you what it is. Courage in the face of the unknown is an important quality in a wizard. Very important. The first task will take place on November the 24th in front of the other students and the panel of judges. The champions are not permitted to ask for or accept help of any kind for their teachers to complete the tasks in the tournament. The champions will face the first challenge armed only with their wands. They will receive information about the second task when the first is over. Owing to the demanding and time-consuming nature of the tournament, the champions are exempted from end-of-year tests. Mr. Crouch turned to look at Dumbledore. I think that's all, is it, Albus? So the details of the test, first off, it is coming up November the 24th. We are now, of course, on Halloween night. This is October the 31st, so a little over 3 weeks away. A little 3 weeks from now, we're going to be engaging in the first test. The tests will, of course, be spread out through the school year because of that aforementioned and oft discussed academic year structure that J.K. Rowling is still using for her books at this point in her career. We're padding it, but in a sense, padding the Triwizard Tournament... I mean, if you're willing to buy the Triwizard Tournament as a piece of world building in the context of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, then I think you are willing to buy the conceit that it lasts for an entire school year. Who knows about the delegations from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang? Who knows what they're up to in the intervening months, in fact, these long months between the challenges. But we'll speculate perhaps a little more about that as we move forward. But here we see something else entirely. Mr. Crouch feeling... less like himself, not he feeling less like himself, seeming less like himself than he was. Close up, Harry thought he looked ill. There were dark shadows beneath his eyes and a thin, papery look about his wrinkled skin that had not been there at the Quidditch World Cup. And then right at the end, we get, if anything, a more damning beat. Mr. Crouch turned to look at Dumbledore. I think that's all, is it, Albus? Referring to Dumbledore by his first name in this very proper and formal environment, but also kind of yielding his authority, checking in with Dumbledore here, seems to be quite unlike the Barty Crouch that we met earlier in the book. More on that, of course, as we move forward. Raven asks, are Madame Maxime and Karkaroff just teaching their own students, or are they going to 7th year classes? Who knows? Who knows at this point, right? We're going to have to pay close attention and see if we can discern some clues. I didn't actually mention way back at the beginning, speaking of clues about Durmstrang and Beauxbaton, this is one of those things that Rowling does gloss, I think, but glosses actually quite effectively. They are still mysterious and magical, one in a positive, airy, as I said, French Renaissance Court of the Sun King kind of way, and the other in this stern Eastern European Slavic kind of way. They are both mysterious throughout the school year, the delegations from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, respectively. I think that works rather beautifully. I didn't mention back in the very first slide that we discussed tonight that when they're looking at Harry's scar, the boy who has food stains all down his shirt nudges a girl who is standing next to him. That is the proof that there are girl students in the Durmstrang delegation. That's it right there. That is, in fact, the only reference, to the best of my recollection, that we get regarding a female student from Durmstrang. And as we mentioned earlier, we've already had mention of a male student or a male student contained within the Beauxbaton delegation too. So we know that both schools are co-ed schools. We have firm evidence for that. That does nothing to detract from the thematic impact of this opposition of masculine and feminine, of dark and light, almost. We can kind of lean into that idea too. And also silver and gold, which I find a really interesting piece of opposition here too. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move on. Let's pivot away then from this secret room, this bonus room of requirement right next to the Great Hall, and get back to what is really important. Harry glanced at Cedric, who nodded, and they left together. The Great Hall was deserted now. The candles had burned low, giving the jagged smiles of the pumpkins an eerie, flickering quality. So, said Cedric with a slight smile, we're playing against each other again. I suppose, said Harry. He really couldn't think of anything to say. The inside of his head seemed to be in complete disarray, as though his brain had been ransacked. So, tell me, said Cedric, as they reached the entrance hall, which was now lit only by torches in the absence of the Goblet of Fire. How did you get your name in? I didn't, said Harry, staring up at him. I didn't put it in. I was telling the truth. Oh, okay, said Cedric. Harry could tell Cedric didn't believe him. Well, see you then. Instead of going up the marble staircase, Cedric headed for a door to its right. Harry stood listening to him going down the stone steps beyond it, then slowly he started to climb the marble ones. Was anyone except Ron and Hermione going to believe him, or would they all think he'd put himself in for the tournament? Yet how could anyone think that when he was facing competitors who'd had 3 years more magical education than he had, when he was now facing tasks that not only sounded very dangerous, but which were to be performed in front of hundreds of people? Yes, he'd thought about it, he'd fantasized about it, but it had been a joke, really, an idle sort of dream. He'd never really, seriously considered entering. But someone else had considered it. Someone else had wanted him in the tournament and had made sure he entered. Why? To give him a treat? He didn't think so, somehow. To see him make a fool of himself? Well, they were likely to get their wish. But to get him killed. This is our absolute assurance from the narrative voice of the novel that, in fact, we're not going to get a late-stage reveal. Harry said goodnight to Cedric, then leaned against the wall, thinking how clever he had been to elude the age line under the guise of his invisibility cloak and drop his name into the Goblet of Fire. We're not getting a late reversal here. We're not getting a flashback reveal that explains Harry's presence in the Triwizard Tournament at this point. He's sincere. He's speaking honestly to Dumbledore, to Cedric, to everyone, but most importantly, to the reader. There is no dramatic irony here. We are on the same page as Harry. He is not withholding from us. We are not aware of things that are still opaque to him. We are in Harry's POV in a way that is, by this point in the Harry Potter series, actually kind of unusual. This feels almost like a throwback to an earlier book in the series, even a pre-Azkaban kind of book, right? As Harry has matured, we have been less caught up in this flow of internal monologue from Harry. It happens less and less often, but this fragmented flow of internal monologue, this fragmented by ellipses kind of unattributed dialogue that we get here, dominating, superseding the narrative voice, we've observed exactly this before from Harry. Yes, he'd thought about it. He'd fantasized about it. But it had been a joke, really, an idle sort of dream. He'd never really seriously considered entering ellipsis, 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 right? We're getting this fragmented kind of constantly revised thought process as he moves forward. I like very incidental detail, by the way, that Cedric is heading off to the Hufflepuff common room. That's all we know about the Hufflepuff common room. It is not upstairs, it is downstairs. That's going to do for now. And when I say all that we know, it's all that we know within the context of this book, at least. It's interesting that Cedric is still extending the hand of friendship to Harry. So, he says with a slight smile, we're playing against each other again, so tell me, how did you get your name in? And then when Harry denies it again, like, it would be one thing to say, okay, you can tell me the truth. Did you really with the goblet? Because that would have been like, okay, I'm proving myself a friend to you here, Harry. Like, it's okay if you did. You can tell me, your buddy Cedric. And Harry says, no, I didn't do this. I'm telling you the truth. And Cedric does not believe him. It is unthinkable, despite the fact that Mad-Eye Moody has pointed out a number of ways of circumventing the age line and circumventing the rules regarding the Goblet of Fire at this point. It seems more likely than not that Harry didn't put his name in. Why is everyone having so much trouble believing Harry Potter's innocence right now? You know what? Let's put a pin in this until we get a chance to talk about Ron's response. You will note here, was anyone except Ron and Hermione going to believe him, or would they all think he'd put himself in for the tournament? God, worst case scenario, everyone in the school except for Ron and Hermione thinks that I did this thing. Turns out that's not actually the worst case scenario. Harry goes back to the Gryffindor common room where he is kind of reluctantly feted by the Weasley twins and by Lee Jordan, by all the other Gryffindor kids. They're celebratory because they've got their own champion and they don't have to invest their hope and their desire for triumph and victory in a Hufflepuff champion, though, you know, they would support him, but still, it's better if it's a Gryffindor champion, right? Then Harry retires to bed, exhausted. To his great relief, he found Ron was lying on his bed in the otherwise empty dormitory, still fully dressed. He looked up when Harry slammed the door behind him. "Where have you been?" Harry said. "Oh, hello," said Ron. He was grinning, but it was a very odd, strange sort of grin. Harry suddenly became aware that he was still wearing the scarlet Gryffindor banner that Lee had tied around him. He hastened to take it off, but it was knotted very tightly. Ron lay on the bed without moving, watching Harry struggle to remove it. "So," he said when Harry had finally removed the banner and thrown it in a corner, "congratulations." "What do you mean, congratulations?" said Harry, staring at Ron. There was definitely something wrong with the way Ron was smiling. It was more like a grimace. "Well, no one else got across the age line," said Ron. "Not even Fred and George. What did you use? The invisibility cloak?" "The invisibility cloak wouldn't have got me over that line," said Harry, slowly. "Oh, right," said Ron. "I thought you might have told me if it was the cloak, because it would have covered both of us, wouldn't it? But you found another way, didn't you?" "Listen," said Harry, "I didn't put my name in that goblet. Someone else must have done it." Let's look at the last slide, and then we're going to talk a little about Ron. It's a direct continuation of this scene here. Ron raised his eyebrows. "What would they do that for?" "I don't know," said Harry. He felt it would sound very melodramatic to say, "to kill me." Ron's eyebrows rose so high they were in danger of disappearing into his hair. "It's okay, you know. You can tell me the truth," he said. "If you don't want everyone else to know, fine, but I don't know why you're bothering to lie. You didn't get in trouble for it, did you? That friend of the fat lady's, that Violet, she already told us that Dumbledore's letting you enter 1,000 galleons prize money, eh? And you don't have to do end-of-year tests either." "I didn't put my name in the goblet," said Harry, starting to feel angry. "Yeah, okay," said Ron, in exactly the same skeptical tone as Cedric. "Only you said this morning you'd have done it last night, and no one would have seen you. I'm not stupid, you know." "You're doing a really good impression of it," Harry snapped. "Yeah?" said Ron, and there was no trace of a grin, forced or otherwise, on his face now. "You want to go to bed, Harry? I expect you need to be up early tomorrow for a photo call or something." He wrenched the hanging shut around his four-poster, leaving Harry standing there by the door, staring at the dark red velvet curtains, now hiding one of the few people he had been sure would believe him. So first, let's talk about Ron specifically here. What is Ron Weasley's problem? Ron's objection to Harry putting his name into the Goblet of Fire is not that it would have been in contravention of the rules. He would actually probably have applauded Harry for finding some clever way of circumventing the rules, particularly when his brothers Fred and George failed to find a way to circumvent the rules. Ron's problem is that Harry did not include him. He feels that Harry is both lying to him and isolating himself from Ron. He's drawing back from his friend. It's not just the lie, though certainly the lie would be bad enough. It's that he didn't include Ron in whatever his scheme was. Harry's exceptionalism is now doing the thing that Harry's exceptionalism has always threatened to do, which is separate him from his peers. This is why I think I am perhaps more fond of the Triwizard Tournament and of the mechanism of the Triwizard Tournament than a lot of readers of Harry Potter, because I actually love Harry being singled out objectively as a champion, as a potential, at least, hero of Hogwarts. Harry, you don't get to just hang out with your peer group anymore, because it turns out they've never been your peer group. You are exceptional, and this is the role that you are going to play. I find that enormously fascinating, and I find the movement of this plot, though there are individual pieces which are enormously frustrating, and though it can be very difficult to maintain any kind of empathy for Ron Weasley through this subplot here, I'm fascinated by the way that Harry interacts with the notion of his own celebrity, a theme which has been on the table since page 1 of book 1, right? We've been waiting for this for the longest time, and we've had hints of it before, of course, but now we're really exploring it. What happens when Harry is distinct from everyone else, is distinct from his peer group? And that ties into one of the major themes of this book, of course, isolation. And we've already kind of alighted on this notion of isolation through the Sirius Black subplot. You remember Harry writing to Sirius in a very casual way because his scar hurt when he woke from the dream right at the beginning of the book. He writes to Sirius Black and says, hope you're doing well. The weather here is fine. Miss you lots. BT dubs. My scar really hurts. Probably fine, right? If you could just reassure me, that would be great. And then writes to Sirius to lie to him, to say, oh, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. Don't come. Please don't come to Hogwarts because you are absolutely going to reveal yourself and be caught and thrown back in Azkaban. Please don't do that thing. And Sirius says, nice try. And he's coming and we play it off as a intimate, familial connection between Sirius and Harry. But Harry has deliberately lied and deliberately isolated himself. He is cutting himself off let me put it this way. He is making the choice for Sirius. He is isolating himself and doing so through deception. And isolation is an enormously powerful idea. Isolation is an enormously powerful thematic concept throughout Harry Potter. Why is Harry so wretched and miserable with the Dursleys? Well, it's not just because the Dursleys are oppressive and awful. It is because he is isolated. Why did Tom Riddle go bad the way that he went bad? Because he is isolated. Why is Draco Malfoy the way that he is? Because, in a sense, he is isolated. We can go up and down the list of characters here at Hogwarts, the list of characters that we met throughout the expanded Harry Potter universe. In fact, isolation is a bad thing. And this, of course, I suppose this is the inverse thematic statement that we're accustomed to from Harry Potter, because usually what Harry Potter tells us is friendship, yay, right? The lack of isolation, teamwork and camaraderie and friendship, these things are positive. These things are capital G good. Here we're getting an exploration of the inverse. What happens when we not just are lacking friendship and community and connection with people around us? What happens when we are missing family? What happens when we have had those things and they are taken away? What happens when we are isolated? Because to be isolated implies, I think, the pre-existent condition of being not isolated, of being connected. Isolation is the aftermath of connectivity in that sense, right? It is, in order to be aware that you are isolated, you have to know what it is to be not isolated. You have to know what it is to be connected to friends and family and your community at large. That is not where Harry finds himself now. And this is going to be a powerful theme as we move through the rest of the book. We have completed, believe it or not, all of our slides, which I'm very glad to say. I knew this was going to be a shorter session because we were only doing a chapter and a bit. This is great. Next session, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, chapters 18 to 19, The Weighing of the Wands and the Hungarian Horntail. That will be at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, next Tuesday, March 6th. Just a few days away. You're not going to have to wait another whole week for another Dear Mr. Potter session. Next Tuesday afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, chapters 18 and 19, The Weighing of the Wands and the Hungarian Horntail, as we start to really get into the Triwizard Tournament stuff. Actually, that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time doing here in this book. Okay, let me cancel this slide, and we'll take just a little bit more here from the question bucket. Rayla Lynn asking, why do you think Ron doesn't believe that Harry didn't put his name in the cup, especially after the experiences of the last 3 years? Why do you think Cedric is more easily convinced? It definitely says something about their characters. I don't think that Cedric is convinced. I think the narrative tells us pretty conclusively that Cedric is not convinced, but I do see your point, Rayla Lynn. It is that Cedric lets it go. This is not my circus. Harry, you are not my monkey. I'm just going to you know what? If you are lying to me right now and you did somehow get your name into the Goblet of Fire, fine. Like, it doesn't change my day one whit. This is all part of Cedric's kind of affable neutrality, I suppose. This is not his fight, so he's not going to engage with it. It is, though, kind of Ron's fight. And you're absolutely right. Ron is absolutely justified in believing that Harry put his name into the Goblet of Fire, believing that Harry found some way of circumventing the rules, believing that Harry, particularly specifically using the invisibility cloak, right? It doesn't really work out. I'm not sure that the invisibility cloak would get you across the age line. Harry's certainly convinced that it wouldn't, but I like that Ron is thinking of it because the last time Harry used the invisibility cloak, it was to go to Hogsmeade. It was expressly and specifically to break the school rules, to do something that he was not supposed to do something that he was actually, by the the rules of Hogwarts, by the social structure of Hogwarts, actually specifically prevented from doing, by the authority of no less a person than Minerva McGonagall, prevented from doing. Harry casually circumvents the rules there. So I understand why Ron believes it. The harder part is why Ron doesn't believe Harry when he assures him, actually I didn't. Because I don't think that Harry has lied to Ron. I don't think that Harry has built a reputation for being somewhat less than trustworthy with Ron. It's tricky. It's tough to justify this. I do think there's an air of jealousy here. And there is an interesting reading, I suppose, that one of the reasons Ron is responding the way that he is specifically to Harry, specifically being chosen as one of the champions of the Triwizard Tournament, is that being selected as a champion gets Harry close to Fleur. And it is possible that there is still some lingering effect of either the mystical Vila magic that has afflicted Ron, or the much less mystical, riot and tumult of hormones that has afflicted Ron. One of these two things has had some impact on Ron, and it is possible that there is some jealousy regarding Fleur here. Oh, Harry, you're so special, and you get to hang out with Fleur Delacour. Excellent. Excellent. Jealous? Why, yes, I am, actually. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I think there might be something to that. I certainly think that is a potentially valid reading. But also this idea that the rules don't apply to Harry in the way that they apply to everyone else. Also the notion that Harry's exceptionalism has always separated him from Ron, right? That there are some paths that Harry is going to walk that Ron will not be able to walk with him. The world is just different for Harry than it is for Ron, than it is for pretty much anyone else, right? That's ongoing plots, ongoing themes as we move forward. But yes, I think that's a really fascinating thing. Ryan asks, can we talk about pockets in this series? I guess we can, Ryan. I've never thought about them. Here we go. Ryan says, here Hermione fits a box in her cloak pocket, and at another point, Harry pulls the invisibility cloak in his pocket. How big are pockets in this universe, and where can I get one? I'm guessing robes have voluminous pockets, right? The students of Hogwarts don't seem to carry bags. They don't seem to carry messenger bags or backpacks or, the kind of bags that we would associate with schools. And I'm guessing that if you're wearing a fairly loose-fitting robe, actually large pockets wouldn't be that bad. Specifically, the invisibility cloak, I think, is supposed to be gossamer light and extremely thin. So I don't think that the invisibility cloak would be too difficult. I imagine that thing would wad up pretty small if you were trying to shove it into your robe pocket. The box, I'm less sure about. Yes. Yeah, I think, again, just part of the logistics of living in the Harry Potter universe that J.K. Rowling doesn't really want to consider. And fair play to her for that. Just everyone gets a bag of holding. It's not mentioned, but it is implied that when you arrive at Hogwarts on your first day, you're just given a bag of holding, a pocket of holding into which you can fit an infinite number of things. That's my explanation anyway, and I'm sticking to it. Let me see here. Lauren asks, given what we learned later about how the cup was fooled, I always figured that the schools were written on the parchment. Wouldn't Dumbles have noticed that Harry's had a different school on it? Absolutely, right? That is... I guess we're not even jumping the timeline, really, because Mad-Eye Moody has already posited this as a hypothesis, right? This is why the Goblet of Fire was guaranteed to pick Harry, is that it was going to randomly select a Beauxbaton kid, randomly select a Durmstrang kid, randomly select a Hogwarts kid, and then randomly select the one kid that goes to Harry's school for the Performing Awesome, right? That's the explanation for why Harry is there. But you're absolutely right, Lauren. The parchment that floats out clearly does not have that school written on it, or Dumbledore would notice it immediately. I don't know. Is there maybe an exception? Is the absence of a school, is the confundus charm that is apparently placed upon the Goblet of Fire sufficient to render the absence of a school like a fourth school? Is that what is suspicious about Harry's note? Is that actually it doesn't say Harry Potter Hogwarts, it just has his name on it? Maybe. I'm not sure about that. But yeah, it is interesting. Yeah. Good. Let me see here. Excellent. All right, let's, just to make the actual question more visible, says Baru, how can Harry be in a binding contract when he's a minor under duress? Is it binding akin to an unbreakable vow where he is compelled to participate, i.e. his will is taken over? Are there any obvious loopholes, like he could just stand still at the starting lines of each event until time runs out? Gosh, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? Okay, what are the bounds of the magical contract? What are the actual limitations placed upon Harry? Does he have to participate in the events? I don't think so. I think that being nominated does not even necessarily compel him to take part in the specific challenges. except that he's Harry Potter, so he's going to, I suppose. Let's pay very close attention to that when we get to the challenges and see if we can spot deep in the secondary world building here any particular details that would lead us to believe, oh no, look, he's obviously being magically compelled at this point, right? Obviously, this is the geas that has been put upon him. This is the magical the magical influence that is exerting itself over him at that point. But yes, I think from a point of first principles, yeah, presumably he could just stand there. Presumably he could. I mean, what happens if a contestant in the Triwizard Tournament gets sick and can't compete? What happens if you, I don't know, for example, have all the bones removed from your arm and definitely can't take part in the first challenge? Are you still obliged to? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It may be possible. It may be possible to approach this from the opposite direction, right? And instead of looking at what it is that compels Harry to take part in the Triwizard Tournament, instead look at this as a question of legitimacy and validity. The representatives of the other schools, the other champions, still want to compete. This is still going to be very important for the remainder of the school year, right? This is a big ticket occasion here. This is an important event for all three of these schools. We're dedicating a year of these students' academic lives to it. You know, and not just the champions who aren't taking end of year exams and who, to all intents and purposes, could just completely ignore the syllabus that they've been presented with for the next school year, but also the other representatives, right? All of the kids who are taking time off to watch these challenges. The Bobaton and Durmstrang delegations who've been sent to live at Hogwarts for a year, to live in a carriage or to live in a ship for a year. I mean, this is enormously important. And the inclusion, of course, of both Barty Crouch and Ludo Bagman from the Ministry. Like, this is important. Even Cornelius Fudge himself. This is important stuff. Capital I, capital S there. So perhaps Harry's inclusion in the Triwizard Tournament is a question of legitimacy. These are the champions that have been selected. The champion who wins, the person who takes home that grand prize, who takes home that trophy, who wins immortal fame, in the words of Dumbledore, that person has to be the best of the champions who are selected, right? If Harry is chosen and then doesn't compete and Cedric wins, it's always going to come with an asterisk. It's always, if Fleur is triumphant, it's always going to come with an asterisk. Yes, Fleur beat the other champions that year. Well, technically she beat Victor and Cedric because Harry didn't take part. Maybe this is a question of legitimacy. Maybe this is a question of validity for the Triwizard Tournament itself, which exists, of course, to foster closer connections between these three schools specifically, but the wizarding world in general, I think, right? This is the thing that connects the Triwizard Tournament back to the Wizarding World Cup, is this notion of an international wizarding community and how important that is. So maybe I'm kind of interested in that idea, but that is broad speculation. Yeah. Joseph Shannon quoting the line from Dumbledore here, he wasn't smiling. Is this the first time in the series that we get the sense that Dumbledore was actually worried about something? Here's my accompanying question, Joseph. What does Minerva McGonagall say to Dumbledore, right? When Harry Potter's name is read aloud, Minerva McGonagall gets up, walks past Professor Karkaroff, and goes to Dumbledore and whispers in his ear, and at that point, Dumbledore invites Harry up. What does Minerva McGonagall say? What is happening behind the scenes here? Is this, hell, this is a fearsome disaster, Minerva. This is all going to go terribly. I can't believe how embarrassed I am right now. Or is it that little bastard Potter, that kid again? This is, I don't know, let me count, the fourth year running that we've had some kind of trouble with that Potter kid? Why did we ever take him to Hogwarts in the first place? Why did we ever accept him? It's always something with this kid. Seems like a year can't go by without Harry Potter having some kind of adventure. I don't know. He is clearly worried about something, right? And you'll remember back in Sirius Black's letter to Harry, he credits Dumbledore with reading the signs. Like, Dumbledore knows that something is up, and anything right now, particularly anything this high profile, is going to pop up on his wizardy radar. Like, he is going to be aware something bad is happening, something bad is coming. We've just had the Dark Mark and the Death Eaters back at the Wizarding World Cup, which feels, within the context of Dear Mr. Potter, like 1,000,000 years ago, right? It feels like a long time since we discussed that, but that just happened. Now here we are, Triwizard Tournament, the eyes of the world are watching us, and Harry Potter's name comes out against the rules. Like, I don't believe that Dumbledore believes that Harry circumvented the rules. I believe that he is, yes, conscious that this is some kind of threat, some kind of ploy, some kind of plan. Yeah, that's how I would read it anyway, but great question. Okay, I'm actually at time. If you guys would like to, Vicadi's asking, let's make this the last question. Vicadi's asking, I really like this time slot. Can we make it the official time of Dear Mr. Potter? No, sadly not. This is quite a crunch for me to do this on a Friday evening. Friday evenings are generally very tough for people to make it. I'm always open to the idea of moving Dear Mr. Potter around. Right now we're alternating between that 10 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Eastern, time slot on Tuesdays. That's pretty much when we have the time to do it. I know that's inconvenient for some people, but it's impossible to find a time that is convenient for everyone unless I just broadcast on this channel 24 hours a day and talk about Harry Potter constantly, and you can dip in and dip out. And actually, that doesn't sound so bad now that I propose it like that. Hey, head on over to patreon.com/PointNorthMedia and support a 24-hour streaming Harry Potter station. That's not a promise that I can make. That's a ridiculous thing. Yeah, it's difficult to schedule a time that is good for literally everyone. So I do try and make it as accessible and as flexible and also, crucially, as consistent as possible. But maybe we'll do some more Friday evening sessions too. Hey, I'm always looking for a new time slot for a new podcast. Guys, I think that is going to do it. Thank you all so much for joining me this evening. If you have other questions, you can get in touch with me directly by emailing pointnorthmedia@gmail.com, or you can head on over to the brilliant Point North Media forum at pointnorthmedia.com/forum. Go sign up there and talk about Harry Potter. Let's go figure out the goblet, shall we? We probably can't. We probably can't try and figure out the goblet. That is going to do it for this episode of Dear Mr. Potter. As I said, next week, chapters 18 and 19, The Weighing of the Wands and the Hungarian Horntail. That is at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, March 6th. Next Tuesday afternoon, fingers crossed, touch wood, God willing, and the creek don't rise. We won't have any more technical problems for a little while. I can't believe I just said that out loud on the internet. That seems very foolish of me. I will be back, if you are joining me live right now, I will be back in half an hour with the Patreon-exclusive book club, in which I'm discussing the end of Madeleine L'Engle's fantastic A Wrinkle in Time. I hope you will join me for that. I will see you all again very soon. Until then, take care and mischief managed. Good night, everyone.